1,000 people have already died in this latest outbreak, most of them in Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia. We can find out more about these drugs and what impact they might have on the epidemic with Professor Jonathan Ball, who's a specialist in molecular virology. Thanks very much for being with us, Professor Ball. First up, can you just give us a brief reminder in layman's terms of what the Ebola virus is, its symptoms and why it's so deadly?
Okay, the Ebola virus has originated from animals, probably bats. It's then got into human populations where it causes a very serious infection. And the current outbreak is about 60% of people die. It's not highly contagious. It's passed on through contact with body fluids from somebody who's infected. And the problem at the moment is really breaking these transmission chains in West Africa. So that's really why we're seeing the outbreak pretty much out of control at the moment within the affected countries. And that's why there's extra effort being made to try and bring this outbreak to a stop.
Let's talk about one of the drugs we were mentioning, ZMapp. Now, this is intended to treat people already suffering with Ebola. It's already been used on 2 doctors in West Africa who contracted the illness, and it has seemed to work on them. How easily could ZMapp be used to treat the hundreds of other people who are suffering with Ebola?
The reality is that it can't really be used to treat the several hundred suffering from Ebola, mainly because they're incredibly short supplies. In fact, ZMapp or MAP have given all of their existing stocks for treatment. There's only a handful of doses, really. And so it's going to be a constant battle to be able to produce sufficient of the drug to meet the current demand.
There's also a potential vaccine in the pipeline too that we've mentioned coming from Canada. But as we've said, these drugs have not been fully tested. How big is the risk of people who might take these experimental drugs?
There's always a risk with any intervention. That's really why we have clinical trials. And the first part of a clinical trial is to literally do that, is to check how safe these drugs and vaccines are. At the moment, there's only one of the pipeline therapies which has entered into clinical trials, early clinical trials, and that therapy or that trial was stopped. So we really are stepping into the unknown in terms of whether or not these drugs or vaccines will work, and also whether or not they'll be safe. And of course, that could present problems in the future. If there are side effects, then clearly people may start asking questions as to why these drugs were given. But I can fully appreciate that at the moment, if you have Ebola and somebody offers you a helpline considering the 60% fatality rate, then understandably people are going to be willing to try anything.
And really, if Ebola is so deadly, and it has been known about for several decades now, why isn't there more research and funding into treatments and vaccines?
It's a very good question, and I think the bottom line is that really the number of people who are affected by Ebola virus throughout the decades has been relatively low. And so companies really, if I was being hard-nosed, it's unlikely that they're going to invest significant amounts of money because simply there's not sufficient profit. Add to that the fact that these outbreaks generally occur in the poorest of the countries, and you can see why drugs companies perhaps aren't too interested in these infections. Funnily enough, the treatments and vaccines that we've got have arisen mainly out of funding from governments, which was aimed particularly to meet a bioterrorism threat. People were worried that Ebola virus could be used in germ warfare. So that's really why we've got the therapies that we have.
Thanks very much for all those insights, Professor Jonathan Ball, specialist in molecular virology at Nottingham University in the UK.